The quarterback position is widely regarded as the most important in the game of football, and since the NFL's inception in 1920, we have witnessed them evolve over the last century, from starting off as glorified running backs in the early days to becoming the true definition of a dual threat in the present day. But how did we get here, and what sparked the desire for a do-it-all quarterback? Here's the evolution of the quarterback position. Pre-merger, 1920 to 1966. When football was first starting to be played around the world, quarterbacks barely threw the ball at all. Yeah, you heard that correctly. The forward pass we love so much today was actually illegal until the year 1906. This meant that before it was legal, quarterbacks primarily just turned around and handed it off to hard-nosed halfbacks and fullbacks. It wasn't until the 1950s when the quarterback position really started to pass the football, but due to the multitude of risks involved in throwing the ball, they weren't allowed to do so very often. For example, quarterbacks had to drop back at least 5 yards before attempting to pass. Another would be that an incomplete pass in the end zone resulted in a change of possession. Some quarterbacks who were prominent in this era were guys like Sammy Baugh, Otto Graham, and Norm Van Brocklin. Post-merger, 1966 to 1979. When the 1960s came around, it was pretty similar, except for a few guys that really stood out. Quarterbacks didn't really prefer to pass the ball due to the incredible number of risks. However, there was a growing trend back then, quarterbacks attempting passes primarily on third downs. And of course, a few quarterbacks didn't resort to these trends and instead wanted to air it out as much as possible. One guy that we just have to mention is no other than Broadway Joe. Joe Namath became the first quarterback to ever pass for more than 4,000 yards in a 16-game season when he threw for 4,007 in 1967. This record-breaking year was the first time that the league had ever seen someone consistently push the ball down the field and still end up being successful. Quarterbacks also really started to toughen up in the pocket during the 1970s due to choosing to hold the ball longer and trying to replicate Namath. And as you might have expected, the rules that are in place today weren't all in place back then. Back in the day, quarterbacks were allowed to be hit incredibly hard in the pocket, and cornerbacks were allowed to play wildly physical with wide receivers. Players like Terry Bradshaw really started to show what a true pocket passing quarterback could do. But outside of the tough pocket passing quarterbacks starting to take over, there was a small hint of what was to come towards the end of the decade. That hint was from Fran Tarkenton. From what I've seen, Tarkenton had ridiculous speed for his era and resembled Aaron Rodgers or Patrick Mahomes due to his wizard-like playmaking ability. In fact, opposing teams probably would have preferred to keep him in the pocket given his talents. He totaled 3,674 rushing yards throughout his career, and compared to somebody like Bradshaw, it was quite a significant difference. The mobile quarterback may not have been overly dominant in the 70s, but the hints of them potentially taking over were certainly right in front of our eyes. The modern era, 1980 to 1999. The 1980s gave us some absolutely amazing quarterbacks that would influence and change the game forever. The most notable were Joe Montana, John Elway, and Dan Marino. These three came into the league and redefined what it meant to be a quarterback. They were also key pillars in the ascension of the West Coast offensive scheme, and while prior teams in prior eras had similar offenses, the West Coast blew up in the 80s. Another key change from the 70s to the 80s was the way that plays were called. It all started when the Dallas Cowboys' former coach Tom Landry was making a push to remove play calling from a quarterback's responsibilities. Throughout the 70s, most quarterbacks called their own plays, but in the 80s, it was like the entire league started to adapt to quarterbacks not choosing their own plays. It has been said that players like Montana didn't consistently call their own plays. Again though, not every quarterback gave up play calling. It was just a trend that started to take shape over the 80s, and at the time, it was a huge change for signal callers back then. When the 1990s came around, it was clear that the NFL started to make the shift from a run-dominant league to a pass-happy league, and after so many years of teams opting to run the ball more than pass it, a new batch of quarterbacks came into the league during this decade and flipped the script. Players like Steve Young, Brett Favre were just the two most notable names from this list of signal callers during the 90s. To back up that previous statement, it was reported that teams were averaging 60 more passes than runs by the year 1991. Fast forward to 1995, and teams were averaging 117 more passes than runs. This trend continued throughout the decade, and while while there were some teams that stuck with the run, most teams changed their identity. I mean, why wouldn't you want to throw the ball more when you have guys like Young or Favre on your roster? With the quarterback that can sling it like that, passing was clearly a more explosive option. Before we move on to the next decade, we have to cover the new style of quarterback that really emerged at the tail end of the 90s, particularly from the style of play that Favre played. It was coined the gunslinger, and it really stuck out from this point forward. Everyone who watched Favre play the game knew he had unbelievable arm talent and accuracy. The only problem was that he could often get a little stuck during his decision making and turn the ball over a lot. In total, he turned it over 363 times throughout his entire career. Compare that to someone like Tom Brady, who has played for more seasons and has just under 250 turnovers as of 2021. Anyone with an insane amount of arm talent who gambled a lot when throwing was given the Brett Favre comparison. The 2000s. The 2000s built upon the foundation laid in the 90s. It was around this time when teams started to care less about a player's physical attributes like height and weight and started to just look for the traits they wanted in a passer. This was when you saw guys like Drew Brees, Peyton Manning, and Tom Brady get drafted. None of them were great athletes who drifted outside of the pocket, and they all had their own negative physical attributes. However, they were three of the best passers in the history of the game. They also helped move the game forward more, with the pass becoming that much more apparent in the NFL. It was also when we saw more quarterbacks taking full control of an offense than ever before. Back then, these guys wouldn't be calling their own plays or really having full creative control with the style and the way they approached the game. During this decade though, excellent quarterbacks were essentially given the keys to the offense. Manning in particular was able to create his own tempo and call his own plays. During the 2000s, it was also clear that passing for 3,000 yards in a single season wasn't going to win you a championship. Guys had to air it out a lot more than they did previously. For example, Peyton Manning threw for 42,000 yards in this decade, while Favre threw for 38,000. The stats back it up. Quarterbacks had to sling it. Not only that, but teams started to pay a lot more attention to their offensive lines than they did in the past. Left tackles, otherwise known as blindside blockers, really started to become a priority. With all of that extra time in the pocket, quarterbacks were tearing opposing defenses apart. Now, before we move on to the next decade, we need to talk about Michael Vick. Drafted by the Atlanta Falcons in 2001, Vick became the greatest mobile quarterback in the history of the game. And while there were stellar runners in the game before him, such as Randall Cunningham, Vick was just in a league of his own. He inspired so many kids during his playing career to play like him that the next era of quarterbacks were almost all mobile just like Vick. Words can't explain or describe how important Vick was to the evolution of the quarterback position. Bottom line, the 2000s were the decade that the quarterback position truly developed into the best and most important piece to a championship roster. The 2010s. Dual threat quarterbacks were everywhere during the 2010s. We witnessed guys like Cam Newton come into the league and put on a masterclass of mobility that had never been seen before from the quarterback position. Russell Wilson was drafted and showcased his insane mobility inside and outside of the pocket. Then of course there was Andrew Luck, who was also mobile in his own right, but for him, it wasn't by choice. We mentioned in the past that there were guys who wanted to run sometimes, but this era took it to a whole new level. Teams weren't all locked into the idea of getting a mobile quarterback either. So much so that they reached for statue-like quarterbacks due to not wanting to deal with the injuries that would certainly arise with mobile quarterbacks. However, the idea was certainly floating in the back of every general manager's mind when they had the opportunity to take a guy that was considered a dual threat. But hey, dual threat quarterbacks weren't the only style that was emerging in the 2010s. The emphasis on leadership really started to come alive here. Veteran quarterbacks who provided a spark when they stepped onto the field really became prominent, mostly because there were a ton of guys active in the league that displayed the veteran leadership that you want from your best player. Look at players like Phillip Rivers, Matt Ryan, Tony Romo, and Ben Roethlisberger. All of them displayed phenomenal leadership qualities, pushed their teams to get consistently better. Without them in the league showing the confidence that you want, newer quarterbacks today might not be so great at rallying their teammates. Present day. And finally, we come to the present day. Being a quarterback in the NFL today requires you to be good at a lot of different things. Mobility is something that is not just interesting to teams, but at this point required. You rarely ever see a quarterback get drafted in the first round if they are unable to get outside of the pocket and find a way to make something happen. Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Lamar Jackson are showcasing what this new generation of quarterbacks look like. Improvisers. The days of calling a play and the quarterback just running it like the head coach wants are over. Yeah, they design the play and probably even choose most of them, but once the ball is snapped, it's on the quarterback. Design run plays for quarterbacks is also a thing that is being used more and more. There were decades when we used to only see a quarterback get a design run when their job was to dive for a 4th and 1 or a 1-yard line touchdown. Now, we see players like Lamar Jackson take direct snaps and go like if he was the running back. With the speed that these new quarterbacks possess, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, Jackson himself has rushed for approximately 1,800 yards since 2020, and Kyler Murray has 1,200, and so does Josh Allen. In just the span of 3 years, these guys are on pace to crush the rushing total held by 2010's passers, with Newton leading the pack with 4,800 yards. As for the next generation of NFL quarterbacks, let us know down in the comment section what you think will be their game-changing skill set. Thank you all for watching, and I'm out.
Tell me why they sleeping on me, on me, oh. Tell me why they sleeping on me, on me.